I remembered the exact sound the door made when it closed behind us. Not a slam, not soft either, just firm enough to mean privacy had been decided for me. The attorney's office smelled like paper and lemon cleaner, and the blinds were half drawn even though it was noon. He didn't invite me to sit right away. He stood near his desk, one hand resting on a thin blue file, the other rubbing his thumb against his wedding ring like he was trying to sand something invisible off his skin. That's when it clicked that this wasn't routine. Something felt off. When he finally looked up at me, his voice dropped lower than it had been in the hallway. "Before we go any further," he said, "I need to know if you're aware that, as of yesterday afternoon, your parents legally removed you as a beneficiary and listed you as a potential financial risk." The words didn't land all at once. They came in pieces, like broken glass sliding across a table. Financial risk. Beneficiary. Removed. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. He hesitated, then added, quieter now, "If this stands uncontested, you could be pulled into over $312,000 in retroactive liability tied to their trusts and insurance filings. Accounts could be flagged, credit exposure frozen." He finally gestured toward the chair. I sat, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles burned. I didn't ask questions yet. I'd learned a long time ago that the first person to speak after bad news usually gives away more than they mean to. He slid the file across the desk but didn't open it. "They signed disownment papers," he said carefully, watching my face, "and they did it with intent." Disownment. I had seen the word in movies, in old novels about inheritance wars, but never imagined it would be used in a room with my name on the door placard. My parents weren't dramatic people. They were strategic, image-driven. Everything they did had a reason, and reasons always led back to control. I nodded once, slowly, letting that sit. The attorney cleared his throat. "There's also something else," he said, fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. "A clause that suggests they believed you would challenge this, which is unusual." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His hands were trembling now, just slightly, and he closed the file instead of opening it. That told me enough. I thanked him for his time, my voice steady enough to surprise even me, and told him I needed a moment before reviewing anything. In the elevator down, the mirrored walls reflected a woman who looked composed, professional, untouched. No one would have guessed that 10 minutes earlier, her parents had legally erased her. As the doors slid open, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "We hope you understand this is what's best for everyone." No explanation, no apology, just the familiar language of decisions made without me. Walking out into the parking lot, the sun too bright, I remembered a dinner from months earlier, the way my father had pushed his plate aside and said, almost casually, "You know, at some point, assets have to be protected." I hadn't pushed back. I'd have he meant retirement planning. My mother had smiled, tight and polite, and asked if I was still happy renting instead of buying. At the time, it felt like small talk, harmless. Now, something felt off, and I finally knew why. Growing up, love in our house had always come with fine print. Good grades earned praise, obedience earned comfort, independence earned silence. When I moved out, my parents framed it as encouragement, but the weekly calls never stopped, always circling back to my finances, my choices, my long-term thinking. They wanted transparency from me, but never offered it in return. A few weeks after that dinner, they asked me to sign something, a temporary authorization, my father called it, so he could handle some tax-related questions that had come up. I read it. I noticed the odd phrasing, the way my name appeared next to responsibilities that didn't quite line up. One detail stuck with me. My middle initial was wrong, not enough to void it outright, but enough to raise questions later. I didn't say anything then. I just told them I needed time. The look on my mother's face wasn't anger, it was calculation. In the days that followed, the tone shifted. Calls became colder. Invitations stopped. When they finally asked me to come in for what they called one last family meeting, I declined. I told them I preferred to communicate in writing. I let that sit. People who rely on control don't like records. Standing there in the parking lot now, phone still in my hand, I felt the weight of what they had tried to do. Disownment wasn't just emotional, it was procedural. It was a move meant to corner me, to isolate me, to make me small enough to manage. What they didn't know was that while they were drafting papers to erase me, I had been filing something of my own, quietly, carefully, with a federal compliance office my parents didn't even realize had jurisdiction over the structures they trusted so deeply. Not revenge, protection. The attorney's disturbed face replayed in my mind, the way his voice had shifted when he realized the dates didn't quite line up. He hadn't said it out loud yet, but I could tell he was starting to see it. The system my parents believed they controlled had layers they never bothered to read. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there for a full minute without starting the engine. My hands were calm, my breathing was even. This wasn't the end of my family story. It was the beginning of a correction. They thought they had moved first. They were wrong. I left the attorney's office without rushing, without calling anyone, without even starting the car right away, because I already understood something most people don't realize in moments like that. Panic helps the person who planned this, not the person it was done to. The door had closed softly behind me, the kind of soft click that feels louder than it should. And I sat there, letting the air settle in my chest while the lawyer's last sentence replayed itself in my head with unsettling precision. This wasn't just emotional. This wasn't just family drama. This was structural, paperwork level, systems level. And my parents were very good at systems. Growing up, they never yelled, never slammed doors, never created scenes. They controlled outcomes. They framed narratives. They liked everything clean, respectable, and documented. That was why the idea of them disowning me didn't feel impulsive. It felt timed. It felt filed. When I finally turned the key and pulled out of the parking lot, my phone buzzed once, then again, and I ignored both notifications because I already knew who they were from. I didn't need confirmation yet. I needed context. The first thing I did when I got home wasn't cry or vent or spiral. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure portal my father had insisted we all use years earlier for family transparency. At the time, it had sounded responsible, almost progressive. Now it felt like a trap that had simply been waiting for the right moment to close. The login went through, but the dashboard looked different, subtly different. Fewer folders, restricted access notices where there hadn't been any before. That's when it clicked. They hadn't just removed me emotionally, they'd begun isolating me administratively. I opened the trust summary first, because that was always my father's favorite instruments of control, and immediately noticed the date stamp at the top, updated 48 hours earlier. The beneficiary list was shorter. My name wasn't missing entirely, which would have been obvious and sloppy. Instead, it was altered, middle initial incorrect. Not enough to void the document, but enough to complicate any challenge later. That wasn't an accident. That was strategy. I let that sit. Then I opened the insurance file. The liability rider had been amended. A new clause tucked neatly into the language, one that reclassified potential dependent exposure in a way that quietly shifted risk outward, toward me. If any of their financial obligations triggered an audit, or worse, litigation, my name could be pulled into the frame without me ever having signed a new agreement. If uncontested, the estimated exposure wasn't abstract anymore. It was documented. $312,000 retroactively assigned through layered trusts and shared filings. I didn't swear. I didn't throw the laptop. I leaned back and thought about the last dinner we'd had together. The one where my mother had asked, almost casually, whether I'd ever consider formalizing boundaries now that I had my own life. I'd thought it was small talk, harmless. Now, something felt off, and I finally knew why. That same night, my father had insisted on walking me to my car, his tone warm, his words measured, reminding me how important it was to keep everything clean for tax season. At the time, I hadn't pushed back. I rarely did. I'd learned early that resistance only made them more careful. Back in the present, another message came through, this one from my mother. No anger, no accusation, just concern. She said they were doing this for stability and hoped I'd understand someday. That was when I realized the most dangerous part of what they were doing wasn't the money or the paperwork. It was the narrative. They were setting the stage for me to look reckless if I reacted, ungrateful if I questioned, irresponsible if I challenged them publicly. They were betting on my silence. What they didn't know was that silence had never meant inaction for me. 2 months earlier, after noticing inconsistencies in a completely unrelated filing, I had consulted a compliance specialist through my employer's legal assistance program. It hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't even felt personal at the time. Just a quiet review, a routine question about reporting obligations connected to inherited assets. The specialist had flagged something then, something about overlapping jurisdictions and outdated disclosures. We'd filed a preliminary notice, nothing accusatory, nothing explosive, just enough to establish a timestamp in jurisdictional awareness. I hadn't told my parents because it hadn't seemed necessary. Now it mattered, a lot. As the evening wore on, I methodically saved copies of every accessible document, noting discrepancies, timestamps, and revision histories. I didn't download anything illegally. I didn't hack or bypass protections. I simply documented what was visible to me at that moment, because I understood that access like this has a way of disappearing once questions are asked. Around midnight, my father finally called. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was calm, almost affectionate, and he spoke as if nothing irreversible had happened. He said they wanted to reset expectations and avoid future complications. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't reveal what I knew. I thanked him for calling and said I needed time to process. That's when he hesitated, just slightly, before agreeing. That hesitation told me everything. He thought he was ahead. He thought I was still reacting emotionally. He had no idea I was already aligning facts, timelines, and authorities that didn't answer to him. When I hung up, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not fear, not anger, clarity. This wasn't about being disowned. It was about being repositioned as a liability without consent. And once I understood that, the path forward wasn't loud or dramatic. It was procedural. It was patient. And it was already in motion, even if they didn't realize that the first move had never really been theirs. The first time I stepped into the downtown office that morning, I felt the quiet hum of fluorescent lights pressed down, like a reminder that everything ahead would be procedural, deliberate, and unyielding. The receptionist barely glanced at me. I didn't push back. That was when it clicked. Every detail mattered. Every minor slip could tip the balance. "Miss Carter," the lawyer called, his voice low, almost trembling as he emerged from the dark paneled office. His hands gripped a thick folder, and the door closed behind him with a soft click, echoing like a warning. "You need to see this immediately," he said. "If this stands uncontested, you could be pulled into over $312,000 in retroactive liability tied to your parents' trusts and insurance filings." I didn't flinch. My pulse remained calm. I already knew enough to move forward, not enough to relax. I took the folder and settled into the seat near the bay window. Sunlight cut across the polished floor, casting shadows on documents heavy with signatures, amendments, and legal verbiage. My middle initial was wrong, not enough to void anything, but enough to raise questions later. I let that sit. One mistake here would expose everything. The past flickered in fragments, dinner conversations about future-proofing assets, comments on what should or shouldn't be in trusts, subtle warnings my parents thought I wouldn't notice. I had cataloged every word, every glance, silently, like a chess master studying patterns without moving a piece. Ethan's observations from last year suddenly made sense. The arrogance, the overconfidence, the assumption that they were untouchable. By mid-afternoon, I had mapped the landscape carefully. Every trust, every filing, every compliance form was noted. The audit trail led to a minor discrepancy with the Federal Compliance Office. Small, almost invisible, yet perfect leverage. I documented it on my laptop, time-stamped, encrypted, and backed up. I let Rachel's text remain unread. "Something feels off. Are you okay?" Her worry mirrored what I wanted my parents to feel. Unease hidden beneath calm. The lawyer leaned closer to my desk as I flipped through the copies. "Everything aligns, but you have to act with precision," he murmured. His hands jittered as he handed me a checklist, trust amendments, liability waivers, and compliance confirmations. The weight of the numbers pressed down, but I let the quiet control speak louder than any raised voice. Late that evening, I sat by the window, the skyline a scatter of light against darkness. My reflection in the glass was calm, controlled, determined. For the first time, I wondered how easily a family could turn paperwork into exile, I thought. Fear was a signal, not a chain. I had learned it well. My next moves would be invisible to anyone who assumed power came from wealth or authority alone. Over the next 48 hours, I executed the first silent exposures. One call to compliance confirmed flagged entries. An email to the attorney confirmed the timeline for retroactive liability. The bank freeze was hinted at, but not confirmed, enough to create tension without resolving it. Advisors started whispering among themselves. Every question they asked was met with procedural calm, nothing more. I was proactive without showing omnipotence, calculating without arrogance. The micro-twists layered naturally, a delayed filing here, an overlooked clause there, Rachel's concern, emails I left unopened. Each piece fed the quiet pressure. By the time the next notice arrived from my parents' legal counsel, I had anticipated their assumptions, but I knew one wrong step could unravel the chain. The tension was tight, controlled, invisible to anyone who expected drama. Evening light filtered through blinds as I reviewed the documents again. My eyes scanned for errors, inconsistencies, anything that could turn the tide in my favor. Every timestamp, every signature, every minor detail became a note in the symphony of strategy. I was proactive, but the chessboard still had pieces hidden in shadows. The lawyers, the compliance officer, the subtle system checks, they all played into a slow, inevitable shift. By week's end, the first ripple appeared. Compliance emails hinted at irregularities my parents assumed were hidden. Bank inquiries were stalled, not by chance, but by the careful orchestration of evidence they hadn't seen. I allowed a small, knowing smile. I wasn't triumphant, I was measured. Revenge was not an eruption, it was a map, and this map was only partially visible to those who believed they had already moved first. I poured water into a glass, the cool liquid sliding down my throat, steadying my thoughts. My reflection caught the city lights. I had no illusions about wealth or sudden triumph. I only wanted clarity, justice, and peace. The chain was forming. Micro-twists were stacked. Step by step, the slow collapse of arrogance, overconfidence, and false security would occur. And when it did, it would be undeniable. Not dramatic, but irreversible. I remember the day starting like any other, sunlight brushing the hardwood floors of my apartment, but the calm was deceptive. It had always been. My phone buzzed with a single notification, an email from the compliance office, flagged with urgency. I didn't open it immediately. I let it sit. I'd learned patience is a form of armor. By mid-morning, my lawyer, Jason Whitman, called. His voice was low, cautious, as though even speaking aloud could make the threat tangible. "They've accelerated the filings," he said. "Your parents are pushing for retroactive changes in trusts and liabilities. If we don't respond carefully, you could face exposure, up to $312,000 tied to previous settlements." I didn't flinch. Not externally. Inside, my mind raced, tracing every transaction, every account, every document I had quietly prepared over the past months. Revenge was not an eruption. It was a map. Still, I whispered to myself, I know enough to move forward, not enough to relax. One mistake here could undo months of strategy. I started with the background verification. The initial review revealed subtle errors my parents had overlooked, middle initials slightly off on key documents, minor mismatches in account numbers, enough to raise questions during an audit, but not enough for immediate invalidation, a micro flaw perfectly suited for later leverage. Around noon, I had a brief video call with Marissa, my childhood friend and now my emotional mirror. Her expression was a mixture of worry and curiosity. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "I've never been more sure, Mar. Just follow the papers, not the panic." She nodded, still uneasy. Emotional anchors are subtle, I reminded myself. Never expose full weight. By early afternoon, the compliance officer, a woman named Claire Voss, reached out again. Her voice trembled slightly over the phone. "We've noticed irregularities in trust filings. Retroactive adjustments may be necessary. Your parents didn't disclose certain liabilities." I let her words hang in the air. I didn't need to speak. Silence amplifies authority. As the day progressed, micro-twists unfolded like dominoes. A bank call confirmed pending audits, a ledger error flagged by a junior accountant at my parents' firm, an anonymous tip emailed to the office. All tiny shifts that would cumulatively unravel the control my parents thought they had. Each domino was silent, invisible to the untrained eye, but I could see the chain forming. For a moment, I stared out the window. The city below moved at its usual frantic pace, oblivious to the storm building quietly and the paperwork stacked on my desk. For the first time, I wondered how easily a family could turn documents into exile, and I felt the gravity of isolation. Not fear, not despair, just recognition. This was chess. Late afternoon, Jason Whitman and I met in person at his office. He laid out the updated strategy on a conference table polished to a reflective sheen. Every email, every notarized document, every compliance note was cataloged. "We need precision," he said. "Your parents have leverage, but it's limited. One slip and they lose all moral authority in court." I nodded. Every move must appear reactive as we planned proactively. I reviewed every detail: past settlements, trust agreements, liability clauses, dollar amounts exact: $312,000, $48,000, $27,500, legal terms precise, waiver, audit, settlement, retroactive adjustment. Each document, signature, timestamp, a building block for the eventual reveal. The slow collapse of arrogance was a strategy, not an emotion. By evening, the first ripple appeared publicly. An internal memo circulated in my parents' office, expressing concern over inconsistencies in asset reporting. A trusted aide, previously a false supporter, began withdrawing involvement, citing personal reasons. Micro-twists cascading into visible tremors. Each subtle exposure is more satisfying than an immediate explosion. I returned home, preparing for the final push. Laptop closed, documents stacked in order of impact, phone notifications minimized. The city lights flickered as I poured a glass of water. This was quiet dominance, the calm before the controlled revelation. I repeated the mantra: not rich, free, strategic, patient. My advantage was invisible to them, unstoppable to those who mattered. Finally, I glanced at the compliance email one last time. A single line caught my eye. "Your proactive filings precede any action from your parents. This will be noted in the audit." I allowed myself a small smile. The map was complete, the dominoes set. All that remained was for the natural sequence to unfold. No grand gestures, no shouting, no public humiliation in spectacle. The work was invisible, the exposure inevitable. By strategically letting each authority, each micro-error, each omission surface in the right order, I had turned their attempt at disownment into an audit of their control, and I remained untouched, calm, ready. As night fell, I journaled quietly, recording steps taken, responses received, evidence cataloged. My reflection in the dark window was steady, resolved. The mid-game was ending. I wasn't yet victorious, that would come in part 5, but control had quietly shifted, and for the first time I felt the faintest taste of true freedom on the horizon. I woke that morning with a quiet certainty I hadn't felt in years. The apartment was still, the city beyond my window slowly waking up. A folder sat on my desk, thick with papers I'd meticulously compiled over the past months. Trust amendments, notarized waivers, proof of my filings that predated my parents' disownment attempt. My phone buzzed. A single alert from Jason Whitman. The law firm had completed the final audit on my counterclaims. Everything was in order. I didn't smile. That wasn't my style. Calm, controlled, measured. This was the language I spoke now. Revenge wasn't a scream. It was a map, a plan executed one calculated step at a time. The doorbell rang. My gut tightened. I had expected this call all week. It was a private courier, a thick envelope with my parents' signatures on the disownment papers they thought they'd finalized. The irony was almost cinematic. I slid the documents open and compared dates, notarizations, and filing stamps. Every line had been anticipated, accounted for. They didn't know that while they drafted their paperwork to erase me, I had already filed my own legal claim, perfectly timed, perfectly silent, under federal oversight. I placed the envelope beside my laptop and leaned back. They thought they moved first. They were wrong, I whispered. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the compliance officer I'd been quietly coordinating with. Her voice was low, measured, but there was a tension underneath. Your parents' accounts are on hold. The retroactive liability exposure, over $312,000, is frozen until the settlement review. I let that sit. The calm realization settled like gravity. One small oversight on their end, one misplaced signature, and everything could unravel. I went to the window. The skyline glimmered, indifferent to the battles of one family. I thought of my mother, the woman who had once told me that loyalty was everything, and my father, whose obsession with image had blinded him to caution. Neither had recognized my silent preparation, my patience. Their miscalculation had nothing to do with luck. It was structure, timing, and the meticulous layering of evidence. A soft ping interrupted my reflection. Rachel, my friend, had sent a text. "You okay? Heard the lawyer's call. That's intense." I typed back, calm but cryptic. Everything is proceeding as planned. No need to panic yet. Micro twists of validation, small victories, invisible dominoes falling. By midday, the lawyer's office confirmed what I already knew. My filings were unassailable. They had not anticipated the federal compliance oversight, nor had they expected me to coordinate a legal review quietly in parallel with their disownment process. The documents they believed would erase me now existed in a strange duality. They were real, signed, yet powerless. I allowed myself a brief pause. For the first time, I understood the scale of what I had built, not just a counterclaim, but a shield, a structured, unassailable map of protection. Every account, every trust amendment, every notarized waiver had been executed to prevent impulsive retaliation, to ensure my freedom. There was still tension, of course. Any misstep now, any rushed move, could compromise months of preparation. But I trusted the system I had built. I trusted the law, the meticulous layers of filing dates, signatures, and oversight that no one else had thought to consider. Late afternoon, the courier delivered another envelope, this one from my parents' attorney. They were requesting a mediated settlement. They had no choice. Retroactive liability, frozen accounts, compliance oversight, all pointed to a single conclusion. Their attempt to erase me legally had failed. And yet there was no drama in the room, no shouting, no vindictive gloating, just calm, precision, quiet control. I sipped my water and watched the sun dip behind the skyline. My freedom wasn't flashy. There was no sudden wealth, no vindictive exposure. It was smaller, quieter, yet infinitely more satisfying. A life recalibrated, dignity restored, autonomy secured. I could breathe, plan, and live without the looming shadow of their control. Later, Jason called. "Everything is secure. They'll have to retract or the documents stand in your favor permanently." His voice was matter-of-fact, almost clinical. I didn't respond immediately. I let the gravity of months of silent, calculated effort sink in. This was the quiet collapse of power, the slow but inevitable shift when arrogance meets foresight. That evening, I wrote in my journal, cataloging the evidence, the timeline, every calculated step that led to this point. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, and for the first time in years, I felt a clarity that was almost unfamiliar in its serenity. I wasn't rich, I wasn't famous, but I was free. I closed the journal, leaned back, and allowed a small, private smile. The papers that had threatened to erase my existence had instead documented the exact roadmap to my liberation. The dominoes had fallen exactly as intended, silently, invisibly, and completely. I looked at my phone one last time that night, a text from Rachel. "So, everything's done?" I typed back, "Done. Quietly, correctly, finally." The apartment was still, the night calm. My parents would face the consequences of their choices alone, constrained by the very system they had hoped to manipulate, and I would live, calmly, intentionally, free of fear, fully in control of my future. The sun would rise again, and when it did, it would find me already awake, already planning, already living. The past was documented, the present secured, the future mine to shape, and in that quiet, structured reality, I found my peace.